Welcome to JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Today we're going to begin with Matthew chapter 18. But just for review, in the 17th chapter of Matthew, we had that major event, which we call the Transfiguration, where Jesus, Peter, James, and John went up to the top of Mount Hermon, or somewhere near the top, and Jesus was transfigured with Moses and Elijah right in the very sight of these three men. And it's had a huge impact. In 18, we'll pick it up right after this break.
Very few African mothers ever see a doctor or midwife, yet each mother knows how fragile her child's life is. You see, 26,000 children under the age of 5 will die today because they don't have access to medical care. Your gift of $260, just $22 every month, helps stock a mobile clinic and train healthcare workers to care for young mothers and their children during pregnancy and preschool years. Join WOW Mother Care now. Protect the life of a mother and her child.
I mentioned a moment ago, starting chapter 18, I lied. I've got to do the last few verses of 17 before we get into 18. Here we have a fascinating little anecdote. It's not something you build a doctrine on, and it's not something that is often referred to, but it is interesting. And it relates to Jesus and disciples paying or not paying what was called the temple tax. I'll tell you all about that. But first of all, let's pick it up here in verse 24 of chapter 17. When they had come to Capernaum, those who received the temple tax came to Peter and said, "Does your teacher not pay the temple tax?" He said, "Yes." And when he come into the house, Jesus anticipated him, saying, "What do you think, Simon? From whom do the kings of the earth take customs or taxes? From their sons or from strangers?" And Peter said to him, "From strangers." Jesus said to him, "Then the sons are free. Nevertheless, lest we offend them, go to the sea, cast in a hook, take the fish that comes up first, and when you've opened its mouth, you'll find a piece of money. Take that and give it to them for me and you." Now, this is a very strange passage. I mean, really. First of all, we have no evidence at all anywhere in Scripture that Jesus was ever hard up for cash. A number of theories about that, some of them going right back to these magnificent gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh that he received from these several kings who came to visit him at his birth. But, his disciples were all working men, and they were all very, successful fishermen. And it's obvious that they did not have cash flow problems, or how else could they have left their families for weeks at a time to follow Jesus around, all right? So, we need to disabuse ourselves of the impression that Jesus and the disciples were hard up, okay? A little background. You see in Exodus chapter 30, verse 13, you can refer to that sometime in your own study, make a note of it, Exodus 30:13. Every male Israelite over the age of 20 was required to pay an annual temple tax of 1/2 shekel. Now, 1/2 shekel won't get you anywhere these days in modern Israel. But back in that time, it was, it was a few bucks. In Nehemiah's day, when Nehemiah was rebuilding the temple, there's reference there in chapter 10, verse 32 and 33, that they temporarily reduced the temple tax to 1/3. But even though it was a rebuilding time and people were more hard-pressed at that point of time because of the history that surrounded them, nevertheless, they were still required to pay 1/3 of a shekel as a temple tax. Temple tax, it's like the offering that's received at your church. You got to pay for the electricity. You got to pay for, maintenance of the building. You have staff that you need to compensate, programs that need to be funded. I mean, it's similar principle. But what's interesting here is that when it came to the temple tax, there was a whole civil service component that went out on behalf of the temple throughout all of Israel and collected this half shekel from all of the men who were 20 years of age and older. And so they would go from town to town to town. And it just so happens in this case that Capernaum was their focus. And so they're going from house to house and stopping guys on the street who are 20 and over and saying, have you paid your tax? Where's the record? If you haven't paid it, pay up. And the question was asked, what about Jesus? What about your guys? And what about your teacher? Does he pay the temple tax? Peter says, yeah, I think so. So Peter comes into the house, and the house would be Peter's house, and that was sort of Jesus' home away from home in Capernaum. And they have this discussion. Now, it's possible that the disciples may have been strapped for disposable cash at that point because they had spent about 6 weeks in the Upper Galilee. I talked about that last time. And also in southern Lebanon. They had basically been on a kind of a spiritual retreat. Jesus had been mentoring his guys. And without the usual constant press of thousands of people chasing him around. But, for 6 weeks or so, no fishing, okay? So it could be that there had been an immediate cash issue, but they're back in Capernaum, which is not only their hometown, but also the center of commerce and where their fishing operations are based. And, back to work, guys, catch some fish. One thing we know about Jesus, and I can say this categorically from the record we have of Jesus being tempted by Satan in the wilderness. We know this for sure. Jesus would not perform miracles for his own self-need. Guaranteed. Okay. So you have to, knowing that and knowing the essential middle income affluence of Jesus' disciples, you have to say Jesus here is speaking tongue-in-cheek. There's no record of, Peter casting out a line and bringing in a fish and pulling a coin out. There's no record of that. As I read it, I see Jesus basically saying, catch some fish, Peter, and sell them in the market. You'll have the money you need, and you'll be able to pay the temple tax. Now, you can say I'm taking liberties. You're right to say that. I'm just saying I haven't found anywhere in Scripture that records that Peter went out there, caught a fish, and the coin was in its mouth, okay? Based again on the fact that Jesus would not perform a miracle for his own interest. Based on the fact that there was no real cash pressure. I mean, Peter was a homeowner. He was sustaining his household. All of them were gainfully employed. Jesus never once is fundraising or asking for money for himself. So, putting that all together, I see this as an interesting anecdote. It's fun to read, but I certainly am not going to build some doctrine about fish and coins on the basis of it. You follow me? Okay, enough said. Let's move on. Chapter 18, verse 1. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you're converted and become as little children, you'll by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me." Now, what is going on here? You see it again and again with these disciples. Well, they betray themselves the night that Jesus is betrayed by forsaking Jesus and fleeing. Peter, vehemently, 3 times denying that he knows Jesus. Why did they follow Jesus? And you can spiritualize it. And I suppose there's some aspect to having a sense from the Father in heaven they should follow Jesus. But I say it's got to be 60, 70% self-interest. They expected Jesus to be the present-day Messiah. They expected him to go up to Jerusalem, to establish a throne, call the people to his side, rout the Romans, drive them into the sea, and establish a Jewish kingdom that he would rule from the city of Jerusalem with his disciples as his cabinet. I won't say it was a power grab, but these guys had long heads, and they saw advantage for themselves in the long term. Why not ally ourselves with this guy? Because he's going to rule the world, and we're going to rule it with him. Am I being too hard? I don't think so. Remember the time James and John's mother, the wife of Zebedee, comes up to Jesus with James and John kind of cap in hand, maybe looking at the ground and not, maybe embarrassed to look up, as she lobbies Jesus to say, I'd like my boys to sit in the right and the left hand of you when you establish your throne? Do you remember the disciples just before the ascension? Acts chapter 1. I mean, they've seen him. They've witnessed his resurrection. Many times he's appeared to them. And they say to him just before he ascends, are you at this time going to establish the throne? They were still hanging on to that hope. So, you got to remember all of that when you read this question, who's the greatest? Like Muhammad Ali, I am the greatest. They were, you can't call it sibling rivalry, although there were 2, maybe 3 sets of brothers in the disciples, but it's a kind of a sibling rivalry. Okay, here we all are. Who's the greatest? Now, what's behind this, apart from what I've just described? Well, just a day or two previous to this question, you remember, they'd been up at Caesarea Philippi, which is in the northern part of Israel, right on the border with Lebanon and Syria. And Jesus had gone up onto the mountain where he was transfigured. And did he take them all with him? No. He took 3 of them, Peter, James, and John. The inner circle, as they were very quick, I'm sure, to refer to themselves as, were the special ones. We don't know why Jesus just took the 3 of them, but the fact is he did. The other 9, as they sat there kind of in the shade, sitting by the streams in Caesarea Philippi, saying, what's up with this? What did we do wrong? How come they're getting special treatment? And it could very well be that James and John, who are described as the sons of thunder, which suggests that they probably had short fuses and were maybe quite intimidating, physically powerful guys, they maybe were a little jealous of Peter, because it seems that Jesus gave Peter more preference. What did he just say? He just said to him, you know, you are Peter, and on this rock I'll build my church. Well, why not on us? That's got to be a factor here when they ask who's the greatest. This is not a philosophical question. This is a selfish question. It's a self-interest question. The exclusion of the 9 of them from the transfiguration climb was the straw that broke the camel's back. They were dealing here now with a level of insecurity and probably some jealousy. So who's the greatest, Jesus? I find it interesting, you know, that he didn't rebuke them, Jesus. Instead, there's kids running around all over the place. Maybe it was one of Peter's grandchildren or nephews or, you know, whatever. There's little kids running by, and Jesus reaches out and grabs them and puts them on his knee and says, hey, unless you're converted and become as little children, you'll by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, he's calling on the disciples to be converted? Yeah, that's what he's doing. The disciples, by their ambition, were demonstrating their childishness. Not their childlikeness, but their childishness. They wanted to be prominent in a kingdom whose first condition, ironically, was the abnegation of self. They would have been very poor cabinet ministers at this stage, for sure. In verse 4, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. It's a strong point. The unawareness of one's greatness is a sign of true greatness. I remember one time my wife and I were at a big anniversary party. It was held out of doors in Jerusalem for some friends of ours from the Rotary Club there. And, just a gathering of maybe 100 people in a garden, and we're having a lovely time. And there's this one fellow going around, and I saw him questioning. And at one point he comes to me, he says, yep, there's so-and-so and so-and-so. He's a Chief Justice, and he is a cabinet minister, and there's me. I'm the third greatest here today. I couldn't believe my ears. I thought he was joking. Unawareness of one's greatness is the true sign of greatness. And false humility doesn't work either, by the way. One old theologian said we should, and I'm going to quote him here, flee the pride that apes humility. Flee the pride that apes humility. False humility is a trap in itself. Paul in Colossians chapter 2, verse 18 warns us against it. But the point is this: if you are going to have any status in the kingdom of heaven one day, and the disciples didn't get it, they didn't know what he was talking about really. He says, you got to learn to be like a child who does not have personal ambition, a child who has no insecurities really to speak of if he's being raised in a loving atmosphere, a child who asks no kind of critical, analytical questions, a child who just simply trusts and obeys. A good word for us, no?
The work of the Word of God is stunningly remarkable. We must understand that God has placed His life codes of salvation and healing in the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Jim Cantelon is focused on the messages that God has communicated through the Bible to you and me. Today, it's more important for us now that we learn what God is saying to us. God has placed us here now to be examples and to share the good news of His work with the world today. If you've heard the Divine Mind speak to you through this program, then God has worked in amazing ways to reveal His Word. Remember that this program has cost, and we have been faithful to God to bring this program to you. If you want to give an offering in any amount, we would appreciate it. Send to Jim Cantelon today, P.O. Box 989, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 3Y7. Or call us at 519-415-8341. Or simply visit jimcantelontoday.com.
Remote and rural, these children and their families have no access to medical care. There is no clinic nearby. And when a mother is desperate to save her dying child, she will walk for many hours. Sometimes the child doesn't survive. So we go to them. These tables and chairs under the trees look like a gathering, not a medical clinic. But the doctors and nurses are transforming the lives of the children and their families. They provide primary medical care, classes on sanitation, medicines, and a better understanding of HIV and AIDS. Most of all, they bring hope as they diagnose, treat, and educate families. This clinic is a gift from donors that will transform their lives. You can become part of that transformation. Your gift of $25 will provide health care for an entire family. $100 provides care for 6 families. Be a part of real change. Go to wowmission.ca/saveachild.
Just a transition here. Verse 5, whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. There's a nuance here. Jesus is reminding us that children belong to him. And he has a special relationship with them. And when you are kind to a child, you're being kind to Jesus. That's basically what he's telling us there. I don't have to say any more than that. Verse 6 of Matthew 18. Whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and he were drowned in the depth of the sea. Woe to the world because of offenses, for offenses must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. If your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off, cast it from you. It's better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into everlasting fire. Jesus had a very high view of children. That's very clear. Later on in Matthew 25, I think it is, where he's judging the nations, he says to some nations, you saw me in prison, you saw me naked, you saw me hungry, and you cared for me. And to others he said, you saw me in those conditions, you didn't care for me. Both say to him, when did we ever see you that way? And it's an interesting application, which I will get to in our study, and it's also in my latest study manual, Cantelon's Casual Commentary. But essentially what he's saying here is that the least of these, as he puts it in Matthew 25, the least of these are reference to little toddlers, little ones. Okay? If you cause one of them to sin, you would be better off to be cast in the midst of the sea with a millstone around your neck. I don't know if you've seen millstones, but a millstone is a big rock that's had a hole chiseled out of it, and a post is put through it, and then it is mechanized, if you will, by a donkey or an ox. It goes round and round and round. This millstone pushes down on grapes or olives or grain, depending on what it is you're milling. And because of its weight and the texture of the stone, it grinds it up and produces, the finer quality food or oil or whatever it is you're doing. These things are heavy. I've seen a number of millstones in my years living in Israel that are from ancient times, especially in Capernaum. You'll see a few great examples, but other parts of Israel, they're so heavy. I'm a big guy and I'm strong, but I can't lift them. They're just way too heavy. They must weigh 300 or 400 pounds. That's what he's talking about here. One of those things is hung around your neck with a rope and you're cast into the Sea of Galilee. Well, you're going to go immediately to the bottom. You have no chance of escape and you're going to drown. Now, the interesting thing about this is that the millstone punishment, according to Jerome, one of the early church fathers, says it was practiced in the Galilee for years and it was adopted by the Romans. And believe it or not, it was seen as a humane punishment for felons in the Greek judicial world, because the Greeks did it too. Humane because there was no real suffering. You just drown. And, it doesn't take long to drown. And there's no pain involved. It happens so fast. Okay. The horror of the millstone around the neck thing was not the death, but for the Jew, it was the lack of a proper burial. Proper burial, critical in historic Judaism. And to this day, I've seen it again and again when I lived in Jerusalem, when Orthodox Jews especially die, they bury the person before sundown, if at all possible. It's a very humble burial. They just wrap the body in a shroud. They don't put it in a casket. They don't treat the body with any kinds of preservatives. They wrap it, put it in the ground, bury it, and literally by sundown, the funeral has taken place. But the point is that it is then memorialized, usually with a kind of a rock or stone kind of rectangular box that's put on top of it, and the name is carved in, and then people will come and visit it over the years, and every time they visit, they leave a little stone on that marble box as a remembrance of their visit. To be buried that way is to be buried in an honorable way. And you need to know, those who have been bereaved, where your loved one's body and eventually bones lay. And there is great dignity, almost a sacred aspect to being buried properly. The millstone in the neck, whoosh, to the bottom of the sea, bad way. Not just bad way to die, but just a bad way generally, because your body can never be visited, your bones can never be collected, and nobody will ever remember you. That was the issue there, far more than the quick death. And so as Jesus used that imagery, it was powerful and received with sober minds.
Cantelon's Casual Commentary Volume 2 is here. The focus of this book is Matthew chapters 5 through 7, the Sermon on the Mount, called the greatest sermon of all time. Gain background and insight into the Beatitudes, being salt and light, how to love your enemies, and the Lord's Prayer. We'd like you to have your copy of Cantelon's Casual Commentary Volume 2. If you're already a monthly partner, it will be sent out to you automatically in the next few weeks. If you would like to order Volume 2, you can do so by sending a gift in any amount. Call us at 519-415-8341 or write to Jim Cantelon today, P.O. Box 989, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 3Y7, or visit us online at jimcantelontoday.com. Request Cantelon's Casual Commentary Volume 2 and it will be sent to you.
I'm excited about next month's programming. All 4 days or Sundays of programming, I'm going to have Brian Stiller with me, who is the global ambassador for the World Evangelical Alliance. What a fascinating guy. You're going to love it. Plus, I'll be continuing my teaching. And remember that we need your support. That's how this thing is fueled. I'm making available to you in tranches, volumes 1, 2, eventually 3 and 4 of my study of Matthew, Cantelon's Casual Commentary. And you know how to get to me. The coordinates are there throughout the course of this show. Get yours. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Contact us. Jim Cantelon today. P.O. Box 989, Burlington, Ontario, L7R 3Y7. If you're sending a check, make it payable to Jim Cantelon today. Or visit us online at jimcantelontoday.com and click Support.